In the coming 10 slides, we will mostly talk about prices, wages, and labor allocation. As you know, we are talking about two product of two goods. One is cloth and another is food. And for food, land is a fixed factor, and for cloth, capital is a fixed factor, and labor is mobile between both of these sectors. So someone could either work in food industry or work in a production of cloth. So labor is a mobile factor and capital and land is fixed factor. Our main goal in the coming 10 slides is to know how this labor is allocated between these two industries. So what happens or which factor decides how many people will work in food industry and how many will work in cloth industry. And it's basically determined by the prices of these two goods, the amount of wages that the labor receives, and some other factors that we will cover. The first point is how much labor is employed in each sector. As I said, labor is mobile, so labor could work in any of these two sectors, and what determines how many people will work in production of food, for example, we have to look at the supply and demand for labor in the labor market. So the labor market will decide how many people will work in food industry or how much will work in um, cloth industry. So what is the demand for labor? I will read it from the slide. In each sector, employers will maximize profits by demanding labor up to the point where the value produced by an additional hour equals the marginal cost of employing a worker for that hour. To put it in simple words, someone will employ a person to the point where the wages of that employee is lower than the amount that the person produces or the value that one person produces. I will give an example. For example, if you want to work in a cafe and you are receiving $10 per hour, so the person will only employ you if the value that you produce by working in the cafe is at least equals to €10 uh, or it should be a bit more because that person also wants to have profit. So that's why at least the cost of employing one person, which is €10, should be equal to the value that that person produces. So the demand for labor, in summary, is a person will employ one person to the point in which the value that that person produces is at least equals to the cost of employing that person. So based on the demand of the labor, each sector will decide how many people they want to employ. In this slide, the demand curve for labor in cloth sector is defined. It's the marginal productivity of labor multiplied by the price of cloth. That equals the wage of the labor. It's the same concept that I've explained in the previous slide. So the wages equals the value of the marginal product of labor and manufacturing. So how much a person will receive in a salary or in a wage depends how much that person will contribute to the production of cloth or the value that he or she will contribute in production of cloth. and the same as the demand curve for labor in food sector. It's equals to the marginal productivity of labor in food sector multiplied by the price of food, and that's basically the wages of that person. In the coming slide, we will see the figure 4.4, and that will present the labor demand in both of those sectors. So once we reach to the figure, I will explain it more in detail. So as I said, the allocation of labor, or how much people will work in each sector, depend upon the wages that is being paid by each sector. The first point says that the two sectors must pay the same wage because labor can move between sectors. That means that the salary of those who work in cloth industry should be the same as for those who are working in food industry. Why? Because if the salaries are different, people are mobile, so labor is mobile, they can go from one sector to another sector. And that will happen until to the point in which the salary or the wages of employees in both two sectors are equal. And if the wages of labor is higher in one sector, more people will try to work in that sector, and as a result, there will be less people working on the other sector. So these forces of demand and supply will bring the market in an equilibrium in which the wages or the salaries of the employees will be equal in both of these two sectors. And as we will see in the coming figure or coming graph, it will happen until that the demand and supply of labor in both industries become equal, and then we have the equilibrium wage for laborers in both of these sectors. So here is the figure, and it shows the allocation of labor in two industries or in two sectors. So on the y-axis we have wages, for example the point WI here is the wages, and then we have the amount of labor used in cloth industry on the y-axis. So here is the labor used in cloth industry, so it's increasing to the right. And on the other side, you have the labor used in food industry, and that decreases when we go to the right. So make sure that you understand that if we are going for food industry from the right to the left, that means less labor is employed in that industry. And the point where you can see at point 1 here, the demand for labor in both two sectors are equilibrium, and then there is one wage which is WI, so there is one wage, and then the market is in equilibrium. So in this equilibrium point, the wage rate is equal to the value of labor's marginal product. It's the same concept that we talked about before, that the wage of a person is according to the value that they contribute in production of either cloth or food. So wage reflects the marginal productivity of labor. Now we turn to the production possibility frontier. The question is, at which point will the economy produce a combination of these two goods? It's basically depends upon the relative prices of two goods. As you can see, the economy produces at point on its production possibility frontier where the slope of that frontier equals minus the relative prices of clothes. So the question is how much the economy will produce clothes and how much the economy will produce food. And that's shown by this blue line, which is the production possibility frontier. And this black line, which is the slope, and that's the minus relative prices of cloth over food. When this line touches the production possibility frontier, that's the point in which the economy will produce, mainly that is point 1. To put it in simple words, the economy will produce at point where the relative prices of both two goods are equal, or so that the wages of those who work in the food industry is relatively equal to those who work in the cloth industry. Our next question is what happens to the allocation of labor and the distribution of income when the prices of food and cloth changes. So now we talked about the equilibrium given the prices of cloth and food, and we said okay, it will be labor will be distributed according to the demand for labor in both of these sectors, and we also said that wages will try to balance the allocation of resources in these two markets. Now suppose what will happen if the price of, for example, food increases as compared to clothes. So we already knew like if the price for food increases, that means the wages of those who are working in food industry will be higher, so more people will try to work in food industry. And there are two possible cases. One is an equal proportional change in prices, so the prices of both food and clothes changes proportionally or equally. And the second case is that the price changes in relative price terms. So the price of one good increases much more higher as compared to another. And we will explain more these two cases in coming slides. In case 1, when both prices change in the same proportion, there is no real change in the wages or distribution of income. Why? Because the wages has increased equally in both two sectors, and that means labor are receiving more salaries or wages, but they are not changing their jobs from one sector to another. Why? Because the wages in both sectors has increased. And also that does not affect the real income for the capital owners and land owners. In this graph you can see that the wages has increased from point 1 here to point 2 above. So from point 1 the wages has increased to point 2, and it's basically a 10% increase in wages. So the wages has increased from W1 to W2 proportionally, and as a result there is no change in the allocation of labor in these two sectors. So the amount of labor used in cloth here and the amount of labor used in food stays the same. It's the same amount of people working in both sectors. There is no change in that. The only change is that the wages has increased by 10%. Now exploring the second case, when the price of cloth rises, labor shifts from the food sector to cloth sector, and the output of cloth rises while that of food falls. So if the price of uh, cloth increases, that means people will earn more if they engage in production of cloth. So that's why those who are working in food industry, they will also want to produce food. Why? Because they want to produce cloth. Why? Because they will earn more wages because the price of cloth has increased. And that's why the output of cloth will be much more higher because more people will produce cloth, and the output of food will decrease because few people will engage in production of food. There is one point mentioned in the slide. The wage rate does not rise as much as price of cloth since cloth employment increases and thus the marginal product of labor in that sector falls. We said at the beginning that the marginal product of labor is decreasing as more and more people are employed in that sector. So that's why the real wage does not increase exactly the same as increase in the price. It will increase, but it will be a bit lower. Why? Because of the marginal product of labor, which is decreasing as more and more people are being employed. We have talked about this at the first part of this chapter. So here you can see what happens when the price of cloth increases by 7%. So this orange line, this line represents the price of cloth which has increased by 7%. So from here to here, and this dark orange is the second line. And here you can see that as the line changes or has when there is an increase in the price of cloth of 7%, then the amount of labor used in cloth is increased from this point to this point. So before only labor were used this much in production of cloth. Now because the price of cloth has increased, more people are being employed in the cloth sector, and these people are basically shifted from labor and food sector. So the food sector goes back from it was at the beginning this point, and this much has been shifted to the cloth sector, and now the labor used in food sector is that much. So less people are working now in food sector, but more people are working in cloth sector. Why? Because the price of cloth has increased by 7%. However, as you can see here, the wages has increased less than 7% because of the marginal product of labor, which is falling. We can also see the same effect on the response of change in a price, in the relative price of cloth, in the production possibility curve, as we have seen it in previous slide. So what happens is that when the price of cloth increases, we said that more labor will work in cloth industry, and as a result, the output of cloth will increase. So as you can see, before the production was at point 1, so the quantity of food was this much and the quantity of cloth was this much. But now because the price of cloth has increased, and more labor are working in the cloth sector, so the output of cloth has increased from Q1 to Q2 to this point, and also the output of food has increased from Q1 to Q2 at this point. So the new equilibrium is at point 2 here. That means as a result of change in the price of cloth, more cloth is being produced and less food is being produced. So in the last slide we said that as the price of cloth increases, so does the output. So more people will work in the cloth industry, and then as a result, the output will also increase. In this slide, you see the same concept of relative supply. So here you can see the prices of cloth on y-axis and the quantity of cloth on x-axis. So this relative supply curve shows that as the prices of cloth increases, so does the quantity of cloth increases. So that's a direct positive relationship between the price of cloth and the quantity of cloth being produced. And given the relative demand, the price of cloth and the quantity of cloth will be determined. So here at point 1, we will have the equilibrium price and also equilibrium quantity for cloth, and that basically shows the relative supply and relative demand and also market equilibrium for cloth. So far we have been talking what will happen to the allocation of labor if the prices of either food or cloth changes. Now we come to the main topic, which is about the distribution of income, or how income is being distributed among labor. So the relative prices and the distribution of income. Suppose that the price of cloth increases by 10%, then the wage would rise by less than 10%. We have already talked about it. Why? Because of the diminishing marginal productivity of labor, or that the labor productivity decreases as more and more labor is being applied in production of one good. Okay, so what is the economic effect of this price increase on the income of the following 3 groups? So now we want to see how income distribution is being affected in case the price of cloth increases by 10%. So that we will see how the workers and also those who own capital and those who own land, their income will be affected. So as a result of increase in the price of cloth, the owner of capital are definitely better off. Why? Because capital is only used in production of cloth. So when the price of cloth increases, those who own this capital, it could be machinery, it could be factory or whatsoever, they will benefit for increased price of cloth. So that's why they are better off. They benefit from any increase in the price of the cloth. And here you can refer to the topic of this chapter, which is the specific factors in income distribution. So capital is specific to production of cloth, and that's why the income of the those who own the capital will be positively affected. So the distribution of income will be in favor of those who own capital if the price of clothes increases. On the other hand, landowners are definitely worse off. Why? First, because land is used in production of food. So when the price of cloth increases, more people will shift to production of cloth, and there will be less food production, and also in relative terms the price of food will be lower as compared to the price of cloth. So that's why landowners will be negatively affected, or their income distribution will be negatively affected, because the amount of food produced will be much more lower, and also the relative price of food in terms of cloth will be lower. For workers, cannot say whether workers are better or worse off. So you see workers as a consumer here. So for them it really doesn't matter, and it depends on the relative importance of cloth and food in workers' consumption. So if the price of cloth increases and the price of food decreases, workers who are also here consumers, some of them they might be better off, some of them not that much. It depends upon how much clothes they buy and how much food they buy. So the result of a change in price of the cloth as a consumer for workers, it's not clear, or it depends. Okay, so far we have been talking about increase in the price of cloth and how that affects the distribution of income within a country. So we didn't talk about trade so far. So it was only about the amount of production within each country and how that allocates the distribution of income. Now we talk about international trade in specific factors model. So how trade will basically affect, or how this theory of specific model explains the effect of engaging in international trade. The first point is that the relative price of cloth prior to trade is determined by the intersection of the economy's relative supply of cloth and its relative demand. So in the previous slides we said that the price and the quantity of cloth being produced is determined by the supply and demand within a country. The second point is that free trade relative price of cloth is determined by the intersection of world relative supply of cloth and world relative demand. After a country engages in trade, or when there is a free trade, then the price of cloth will be determined by the world supply and demand for cloth. So it's not local demand and supply, but what appears in the world market. Opening up to trade increases the relative price of cloth in an economy whose relative supply of cloth is larger than for the world as a whole. So if in a country, if the quantity supplied of cloth is higher than the supply of the world, that means the price of cloth will increase after that country engages in international trade. We will explain this further. So in this slide, we already talked about the point one, which is the intersection of relative supply and relative demand of the world here, but we talked about it at the local market or at the country level, where this was the price and at this point was the quantity being produced within the country. Now you can see that we have a new relatively supply demand for the world, and that's at point 2 here. It's above the relative supply before trade, which was this line. So at this point, the relative supply of the world is much lower. So there is less cloth available or produced internationally. So what happens is that when the economy opens to trade, the price of cloth will increase to this point, to this point. And why? Because the relative supply of the world is at this point, at point 2, and that's much more smaller than the relative supply before engaging in trade. And what are the gains from trade in this model? So without free trade, the economy's output of a good must equal its consumption. Before trade, you should, or the economy consumes whatever that country produces, but international trade allows the mix of cloth and food consumed to differ from the mix produced. That means that a country could consume a different combination of these two goods if it's open to international trade. In other sense, if you are producing a lot of cloth, that means like you can export cloth. You don't have to consume all of the cloth that you are producing and exchange that maybe for other goods, or in this case maybe for food. So being able to consume a different combination of two goods than what you could produce is also a benefit of international trade or engaging in international trade. And the combination of both two goods which are being produced still stays the same, so you cannot consume more or less, but that should be within the amount of your own production. Why? Because you exchange one good to another good. So still the total amount of the both two goods that the country could consume remains the same, but the mix of or the combination of these two goods could be changed or could be improved if a country engages in international trade. The economy as a whole gains from trade. First, because it imports an amount of food equal to the relative price of cloth times the amount of cloth exported. So you can only import food from abroad with the value of cloth that you have exported. Second, it is able to afford amounts of cloth and food that the country is not able to produce itself. So in the coming slide, I will show you it in the graph. So once a country engages in trade, the combination of goods that it consumes could be different from what it produces. And also the budget constraint with the trade lies above the production possibility frontier that we will see in the next slide. In this graph, you can see the difference between pre-trade and post-trade and how trade is beneficial. So before engaging in trade, the output of the economy given the budget line and production possibility frontier was at point 2. So that was the amount that the country could produce and consume given the amount of budget they had. But now the economy can trade its clothes with food from outside, and uh, that will result in gain from trade. And this area is shown by the shaded area in the graph here. And you can compare this area with point 1, which lies on the production possibility frontier, and that was feasible before trade, but after trade, this production possibility frontier, or it's possible to consume any combination beyond this point 1, and that shows the gain from trade. So far we have been talking about the technicalities of what happens when the price of cloth changes and how that affects the labor uh, wages, and also what happens when the economy opens to trade. And now we will make some general conclusions about all the analysis that we have done so far. The first point is that international trade shifts the relative price of cloth to food, so factor price changes. What that means is that when a country engages in international trade, the prices of its product will change, and that will also affect the wages or the rentals of the factors of production of that good. For example, if after trade the price of cloth is higher than before the trade, that means it will affect the labor working in cloth industry and also the owner of capital who are using their capital in production of cloth. The second point, and a very important point, is that trade benefits the factor that is specific to the export sector of a country. So after engaging in a trade, those people whose factors of production are being used in the industry in which a country exports, they will benefit from international trade, but hurts the factors that is specific to the import competing sectors. So those who are in the import competing sectors, they will be negatively affected, and those who will be exporting, they will be positively affected. To put it in our example, for example, assume that cloth is being exported after opening up to the trade. That means the owner of the capital will be positively affected. Why? Because the price of cloth has now raised after engaging in the international trade, and the owner of land who were engaged in production of food, they will be the losers. Why? Because they have to compete with the importing of, for example, food from abroad. So that's why they will be the losers of international trade. And trade has an ambiguous effect on mobile factors. For example, it's not clear if the labor will be positively or negatively affected after engaging in international trade. Why? Because labors, according to this concept, are mobile, so they can go from one sector to another sector. If they see that the food industry is not doing well because there is a lot of competition from abroad, so they can easily switch to production or to engage in and to work in the cloth industry in which the country is able to export abroad and in which the prices has increased after trade. So the main point of this chapter is that once a country opens up to international trade, those factors which are being used in production of a good which is being exported will benefit from international trade, and those factors which is being used in production of good that is now being imported from abroad, they will be the losers of international trade. And according to this model, the effect of international trade on labor is not clear. Well, because labor is mobile, they can easily switch from one sector to another sector, so they can just adjust to the effect of international trade. So now we will talk about more about the losers and winners from the international trade. The main idea is that although some people will be negatively affected by international trade, the overall gain is much more higher, even if we could compensate those who are negatively affected. So the overall benefit of engaging in international trade, according to this theory, is much more higher given that some people are being negatively affected. It's also possible to redistribute income so that everyone gains from trade. That means that those who are in export, those who are producing goods which are being exported, and they gain from trade, somehow we could redistribute their gain in order to compensate for those who are being negatively affected by international trade. And overall, still we would end up having more gains from international trade, even if we compensate for the losses of those who are being negatively affected. However, it's not always possible to compensate the losers, and that's why it's a very contagious point and issue that how to redistribute the gain from trade. So everyone could gain from trade does not mean that they will actually do. Why? Because it's very difficult to compensate the losers and to get that extra benefit from those who are basically benefited from international trade and give that to those who are being negatively affected. So according to this theory, trade often produces losers as well as winners. Some people will be the winners after a country engages in trade, and some people will be losers. And an optimal trade policy would be the one which weighs on group's gain against another group's losses. So you see how much a country gains and how much a country loses in order to come up with an optimal trade policy. For example, some groups might need special treatment because they are already relatively poor. For example, some shoemaker and garment workers in the United States. So if they are being negatively affected by international trade, they might be supported somehow and they should be treated, or the economy should take care of them in case they are being negatively affected by international trade. And overall, although there will be some losers and some winners, most of the economists, they strongly favor free trade. However, what happens is that those who gain from trade are a much less concentrated, informed, and organized group than those who lose. That means that the people who gain from trade, they are not very much concentrated, they are not very much informed, and they are not very much organized as compared to those who lose from international trade. And that's why losers are able to manipulate government policies in order to avoid any losses. For example, consumer and producers in the United States sugar industry is one example in where, as you know, United States imposes a high tax on imports of sugar, and as a result, they want to protect their farmers of sugar industry, and this policy has been supported mainly by farmers who are much more informed and much more organized as compared to the consumers of the sugar, which is basically everyone in the United States. So that's why they are not able to influence government policies for much more free trade and sugar industry. And also in some countries, government provide a safety net to support the losers of international trade. There are some even programs at the United States which try to support those people who, for example, lost their job because of the foreign competition, and such policies are important in order to improve the negative effect of international trade. And as I said, even if we could compensate the losers of international trade, the gains of trade, according to this theory, is much more higher than the losses from international trade.